Before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you about our one and only sponsor or advertiser. It's the GreatCoursesPlus.com app that you can get on your phone, and you can access there. It's a subscription model, so you can access thousands of courses and therefore tens of thousands of lectures, like one here on George Orwell that I listen to, in which then you scroll through and listen to whichever lectures you want, any or all of them. They go in sequence. You can just queue it up and start going, and it goes lecture after lecture. You can see the green ones that I listen to and the other ones I have yet to listen to. It's a great system because instead of buying an entire course and then maybe you like some of it, maybe you don't like any of it or just parts of it, and you want to skip on to the next course, you can do that with this app on your phone. And so those who are listening to the podcast and access it through me, you get a $30 off for the annual plan, and you get a free trial, and it comes out to $10 a month. So that's like 2.5 venti lattes at Starbucks for infinite knowledge, accessible on your phone. It's a great deal. And this is the sole sponsor of the podcast, other than the umbrella of the Skeptics Society that we're under. I'm not going to bring on here, my favorite pillow advertisers and guns and gold and whatever else supports podcasts. It's really the great courses, and I have them on because I use them all the time. I listen to these lectures, and content consumption is something we're all doing in the pandemic, and this is really the best source I've found. So give it a shot. Go to greatcoursesplus.com/Shermer. That's greatcoursesplus.com/Shermer. You get the $30 off and the free trial, $10 a month for the year. Great deal. Thanks for listening. Instead of a guest this week, I thought I should make some comments on the events of January 6th and the fallout thereafter. Just seems like this is so monumental that just having a regular guest talking about ideas unrelated to this subject seems inappropriate for this week anyway. So I'm going to just make a few comments. This won't be long, not scripted, just kind of commenting and expanding on some of the things I've been tweeting about, including on Twitter, whether it should be screening people like this or not. And so let's begin with Donald Trump's own tweet on January 6th, right after all hell broke loose in the Capitol Dome. And he writes on Twitter, "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever!" ! Of course, the next day he pretty much takes all this back and condemns his followers, and then news reports are now saying that many sources are confirming that he regrets having taken back the statement I just read. So I want to talk here for just a moment about what it means to believe something. Do these people really believe that the election was stolen? Yes, many of them apparently really do. Now here I'm not talking about the 100 Republican congressmen and the 16 Republican senators who said that they would support Trump on the January 6th, counting the electoral votes, pushing back against that. I don't think they really believed it. I mean, their own departments, their own government, their own people, like A.G. Barr, who is a longtime loyal Trump supporter and hardcore Republican, a defender of conservative values, and so on and so forth. Not just Barr, but many, many other Republicans pronounced that the election was fair and that there was no evidence at all of fraud or it being rigged or votes being swapped or anything like that. So I don't think the people in power that know what's going on really believed it. They are just virtue signaling, as it were. That is, in a way, that kind of public statement of belief is kind of a winking belief. Like, of course, we don't believe this, but we got to say it because that's what the boss is saying. So, and he's our team leader, so we got to support that. So it's kind of a career opportunism, I suppose, plus public signaling of how loyal you are to the team, much like I think, as I've commented before on climate change, I think ever since climate science got bundled with Al Gore, got bundled with the Democrats and a liberal cause because of Al Gore's film, the brains of conservatives autocorrect climate science to anti-capitalism, anti-free market, or whatever, and they just automatically reject it, just as a kind of that's what our team does kind of belief. So I think that's what was going on amongst the leaders. The rank and file, on the other hand, I think don't really care what A.G. Barr says or what some Republican governor or state election official says about the fairness of the election. Their boss, their leader, Donald Trump said it was fake, therefore it's got to be fake. I think those people believe it. And I think there's millions of them, not just the hundreds or thousands we saw at the rally, but millions. And I think that's cause for concern. If I were Biden, I'd consider not having a public inauguration speech out in the open. It would be really hard to keep that secure. And also, it forms something of an invitation to come in and commit more violence. Of course, I don't know what he's going to do, but that would be my recommendation, and just hope that the whole thing fades in time. It may not. In a way, it's like I'm reminded of the Pizzagate guy. That is the Pizzagate conspiracy theory that the Democrats and a bunch of their minions and celebrities and leaders all the way up to Hillary are running a pedophile ring out of a pizzeria. This culminated, as you know, in the gunman showing up at the Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria in Washington, D.C. with a rifle. In a way, it's going to sound kind of perverse, but in a way, at least he had the courage of his convictions and beliefs. He really believed that there was a pedophile ring. And if you really believe that, let's say, the next door neighbor was running a pedophile ring, and you called the police and they didn't come, or you took whatever legal actions and you thought, well, I better do something about it myself. And you march over there to do something about it. Now, I'm not condoning this, because that self-help justice always leads to violence, and usually not in the good direction. But I think in terms of like, do most conservatives and Republicans believe that the Pizzagate conspiracy theory? No, I don't think they really believed it. That's one of those winking beliefs, it's sort of tribal beliefs that you just spout out. Yeah, I believe that because, I'm a conservative or something like that. And I would apply that to the left as well. These Antifa protesters, so-called protesters and rioters, whatever word you want to use, probably rioters, looters, that we see on TV. Now, of course, a lot of them are just opportunists that really have no ideological fight in the game. But the ones that really seem to believe it, well, if you really believe that America was a deeply racist country, and that pretty much every cop in the United States is driving around looking to shoot a black man, and so on and so forth, you would be infuriated, and you march and protest peacefully, and nothing happens. Well, the reason nothing happens is because the vast majority of cops are not racist. This is a false conspiracy theory, in the exact same way that the rigged election is a false conspiracy theory, and Pizzagate is a false conspiracy theory. By the way, parenthetically, someone who's tracked and studied conspiracy theories for over a quarter century, it's always been treated as like fringe, unimportant, interesting and fun ideas, but not to be taken seriously. So, usually UFOs and Area 51 and, the lizard people running the world and so forth. Conspiracy theories are always kind of put in that category. I think we've clearly seen now between Antifa over the summer and the looting and violence in Portland and Seattle in particular, for example, and other cities. And then, of course, on Wednesday, January 6th, with the assault on the Capitol. Those are conspiracy theories, and people act on them if they really believe it. So here, really, the mission of the Skeptics Society and Skeptic Magazine, and here's our latest issue, appropriately enough, on QAnon, is that the truth matters. Some conspiracy theories turn out to be true. As I always point out, Watergate was a conspiracy theory that turned out to be true. The assassination of Lincoln, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand that triggered the First World War, resulting in the deaths of tens of millions of people. Those are conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. So we can't just dismiss them out of hand. Therefore, applying the methods of science and reason and rationality to determine what is true matters. It matters more than anything else. It's the most important thing we could do. And we've certainly seen that most recently here with these kinds of conspiracy theories. Now, I also want to note, parenthetically, that the counter to it was Trump supporters who mobbed and stormed the Capitol. There is this, and I predicted this within hours of the event on January 6th, unfortunately, that these were actually Antifa, like crisis actors or Antifa dressed up as Trump supporters. And, of course, Tucker Carlson was all over that one. And he had Sarah Palin on, who said, I think I saw some faces there that look familiar, like the ones I saw this summer in Antifa. Right. And Giuliani even said something about that the other day, which I'll find and read here for a moment. But I think it's pretty clear now, pretty much to everybody, that as eyes that can see and ears that can hear, these were truly Trump supporters. Now, I want to comment on the idea that Trump caused the violence. I think he did. And therefore, and I'm recording this on Sunday, January 10th, so this is before we see what happens on Monday and Tuesday with impeachment hearings or discussions or whatever. I suspect he won't be impeached because of the time. And I also think it wouldn't get enough votes in Republicans, even though Republicans clearly see what a disaster Trump has been for their party. I still think enough of them probably are worried about him denouncing them. And then when the midterm elections come up in 2 years, he may still be active in politics and be able to destroy those who voted against him in an impeachment. I know that sounds cynical, but that is the way politics works. And so therefore I think probably nothing's going to happen. And maybe that's just as well. Perhaps it'd be best if he just faded away. Now let me comment about the Twitter ban. And I initially tweeted on January 8th that I don't support that for these reasons. One, we need to know what he's thinking through his unfiltered tweets. Okay, that solution could be solved in terms of him going on to some other platform like Parler or one of the others that may be forthcoming. Two, we now know what happens when he commands his mob, so other less visible platforms will need to be monitored. Hopefully, I presume the FBI is doing that. And three, perhaps most importantly, it sets a censorious precedence. That is to say, once you ban this person, what about this one and this one and this one? And that category, that bin of people we put in there that we deem to be dangerous, the so-called clear and present danger clause in that decision, which I will read to you here. Again, as I said, this is an unscripted podcast. Here's the famous decision by Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in 1919 in the case of Schenck versus the United States. The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. The question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. Well, we know what happened after that. The category of who should be banned, whose speech should be banned because that speech creates a clear and present danger, the equivalent of falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater. Well, the case was involving this man named Schenck, who was the head of the Communist Party in Philadelphia, who was distributing leaflets protesting the draft. Yes, that's what was considered a clear and present danger to the country. In 1919, this was years before that, as the United States was ramping up to enter the First World War, and the United States instituted the draft, and Charles Schenck distributed these pamphlets that said, that's the equivalent of slavery, which was abolished by the 13th Amendment, and he also invoked the 14th Amendment. And in a way, that's a pretty good argument. The government basically saying, we're going to force you into the military and then force you to go overseas and risk your life because we tell you to. That is a kind of slavery. Okay, that's a debatable point, I know, but and that's not my point here. My point here is that once that category was set up, then any kind of protesters that the government deems it doesn't like can then be deemed dangerous, and then that category expanded considerably over the decades, and even Holmes himself later regretted going that far down the road there. Okay, I have a whole discussion of that in Giving the Devil His Due, but my point here is that the problem of anybody censoring somebody. Now, again, these private companies, they're free to do that. This is not the government. Here I was talking about the government censoring people. Private companies, of course, can do that. But should they do that? I think it's probably better that they don't because of that precedence for censoriousness that then expands the category to include more and more people. And therefore, perhaps any kind of, let's say in this case, conservative speech could be deemed dangerous, particularly if you're a liberal and you see that you perceive conservatives to be dangerous to the republic and so on. That's the problem with that. And so I think it's probably best that they don't do that. I mean, they've already done it. They'll just pop up somewhere else, and maybe that's okay. Ultimately, competition is a good thing. And that brings me to the subject of what the right-wing media is now on about. Immediately, instead of showing videos of all the craziness going on at the Capitol, within a day, Fox News was running nothing but commentary about the censoriousness of social media companies censoring conservative values. That became the theme of these shows. And, Dinesh D'Souza tweets something, Tucker Carlson's opening is barely a minute, but it's something every single American needs to watch. So I watched it. And Tucker's going on and on about the Twitter's decision to ban Trump, and this is going to lead to endless censorship of conservatives and Republicans and so on. Of course, that wasn't the issue at all. Trump had been talking about breaking up the so-called monopolistic big tech social media companies for months and months, maybe half a year now. He's been talking about that. And yet they didn't ban him then. They let him say whatever he wanted to say. So in terms of like understanding causality, what caused Twitter to ban Trump? It was the January 6th violence at the Capitol that he commanded to happen. I'll talk about that in a minute. And so, but for that event, Twitter would not have banned him. Therefore, Tucker and Hannity, the cause of Twitter's banning Trump is not censorship of conservative values. It's the threat of violence. Okay. That said, again, generally speaking, I think it'd be better if social media didn't censor conservatives or people like Trump, although I recognize that to be a debatable point. Oh, by the way, here's that Giuliani quote that he tweeted out about, you think those people climbing the wall are MAGA or trained anarchist activists trying to frame Trump, as usual, for crooked Democrats and press. Okay, so let's leave crazy Giuliani out of it, other than he should also be included as possibly one of the causal vectors of what happened. But let me just finish my thought on the breaking up of big tech companies as being monopolistic. Okay, the problem with this, first of all, it's interesting and I think hypocritical for conservatives and Republicans who claim that they're in favor of small government, the light touch of government, and they're always opposing government intervention into the marketplace, the moment something like this happens, where social media companies appear to be censoring conservative content more than liberal content, I'm not actually sure that's true, but let's just say it is true, just for the sake of argument. Therefore, we should break them up because they're monopolistic and they have too much power and control. Okay, you guys are the party of small government, no government intervention into the marketplace, free markets. Capitalism should be free to do whatever it wants, and so on and so forth. Okay, so first of all, there's the hypocrisy of that. And in fact, though, I've talked about this before, this idea that conservatives are in favor of small government. They're not. They're not in favor of small government. They love big, massive government when it comes to the military, the police, the judicial system, prisons and courts, and immigration policy, and building walls and military bases all over the world. You know, we have something like more than 800 military bases. Massive amount of money spent to maintain these military bases. Now, I know conservatives have arguments for why we got to do all of those things. But my point is that they're not in favor of small government. They're in favor of a big, massive, strong government that acts as your father, as kind of the strict father model. I've talked about this with these kind of metaphors of a nurturing parent versus a strict father family parent model for what government should be. That's besides the point. The problem with breaking up the tech companies, I'm against that, is that by the time these things wend through the courts, I mean, you just know Facebook and Google and so forth have just massive amounts of money to hire the best lawyers to fight against the government breaking them up. So this will drag through the courts for years, and that's typically what happens historically. I'll give you two examples. This is from a chapter in Giving the Devil His Due called Another Fatal Conceit. The fatal conceit being that the government can intimately direct and control the economy that it's better that there be more involved than less involved. This being an example. Kodak once so dominated the film and camera industry, at one point enjoying a 96% market share, that government bureaucrats were wringing their interventionistic hands in panic that such a monopoly could bring about market inefficiencies, or worse. Americans would get so hooked on capturing their Kodak moments that the film giant would force addicted consumers to pay artificially jacked up prices. In response, the feds sued Kodak twice for antitrust violations in 1921 and 1954, opening the door for Fujifilm to jump into the market. The result? Kodak and Fuji became a duopoly, and like most gargantuan organizations, both grew sclerotic and failed to keep up with the digital revolution. That, in the case of Kodak, saw their stock price collapse from $60 a share in 2000 to less than 50 cents a share at the time of this writing, which was, I think this was 2011. I wrote this. From $60 a share to 50 cents a share, after the story broke that the fearful giant was preparing to declare bankruptcy. And then as I continue, Apple and Google are hot today, but who knows what a couple of grad students are dreaming up in their dorm rooms this year that in the near future will reconfigure the economic landscape. These giants, which the antitrust regulators are fretting about today, again, I wrote this in 2011, will almost assuredly turn into GM-like lumbering sloths unable to respond in time to the next shift in the economic ecology, and they too could go the way of the Neanderthals. The Darwinian focus for economists should not be on societies and nations, but on companies and corporations. And at this level of analysis, top-down interventions are neither justified by the evolutionary analogy nor necessary for the long-term prospects of either societies or nations. In The Mind of the Market, I also wrote about Microsoft, it being sued for its monopolistic practices of bundling Netscape into their software packages. And, by the time that lawsuit ground through the courts, this went on for years and years, no one was using Netscape anyway. I mean, there was already so many other better options. So my prediction is that, if anything, the events of this week will trigger a massive amount of competition in the social media landscape. or ecosystem, pick your metaphor. And so this problem will be solved long before the courts could resolve it. So I'm against the government breaking up Facebook or Twitter or Google or any of them. I just don't think it's going to be a problem. Okay, finally, let's talk about Trump's role in this. I've been tweeting this morning about this in the context of reading this important book by Judea Pearl, The Book of Why, The New Science of Cause and Effect. So Judea Pearl is primarily a computer scientist, but also a social scientist that studies causal inference. This book is really about causal inference. And so his example, for which I tweeted out this morning, use this diagram here. If you're listening to this, the diagram is on the top, court order, and then there's an arrow that goes down to captain, and then from captain it branches into two arrows going left and right to A and B. A and B are the two riflemen, and that shoot this the prisoner dead D. So the idea there is that, okay, what caused the death of the prisoner on death row? So the capital punishment case. Well, the proximate cause is the guys that shot him. And there's usually more than two. They usually have maybe half a dozen to a dozen riflemen, and one of them has a blank, just in case you think, well, maybe I'm the one that didn't actually kill him. But this is irrelevant because that's not the cause of the prisoner's death. And the next step up, so this is going up the causal ladder, Pearl talks about. Well, the captain ordered them to fire, 3, 2, 1, fire, shoot the prisoner, whatever the command is. But the captain giving the order, he's not the cause of the death of the prisoner, because he was simply given a command from his commander, and that goes all the way up to the court order that said, today is the day he is to die. And then, of course, Judea doesn't take this much further, but you can go further back. It goes back to the court case itself, where the jury had to determine what the punishment should be, say life in prison or death sentence, death penalty. And even that's not, you could go back even further. There's the court case itself that found him guilty instead of innocent. And if you want to go back historically even further into the past, you could go back to Roman law and the development of the Western legal system in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, and all the way up to the abolition of capital punishment and so on. And so at some point you have to stop the causal chain, otherwise you end up at the Big Bang. So I was tweeting about this morning, thinking about that. What caused the assault on the Capitol? Well, Trump did. He gave the orders. I mean, essentially, he gave the orders. I had some other tweets about that. No, he didn't say storm the Capitol and break windows and, grab Nancy Pelosi's podium and put your feet up on her desk. Craziness. But, okay, so I had several tweets about this. In dictatorships and autocracies and any kind of strongman organization where there's a top strongman at the top, this could be the mafia, or I also used Hitler as an example, in the context that there is no order by Hitler to exterminate the Jews. Okay, the Holocaust deniers exploit this. David Irving famously put up $1,000 to anyone that could produce the order from the Fuhrer to exterminate European Jewry. There is no such order, but it wasn't necessary. The phrase that one historian used was working toward the Fuhrer. Everybody knows what the Fuhrer wants. They all know his attitudes about Jews. He made that quite clear, not just in Mein Kampf, but elsewhere. Again, an argument against censorship. It's good we know what these people are thinking. In the case of Trump, it's unfiltered, free association by the minute. In the case of Hitler, without that kind of technology for dispersing his ideas, it was harder to see and take seriously early enough to do something about it. That's a separate question. But the underlings beneath Hitler, they knew what he wanted done. And therefore, it was only a matter of, kind of carrying out orders that came from people below Hitler. But ultimately, Hitler is the cause of the Holocaust. And I go so far as to say, no Hitler, no Holocaust. It would not have happened. And there's even historians now that think no Hitler, no Second World War. And no Second World War, there'd be no reason to have ever developed nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. So Hitler really is a causal vector for so many things. But in that causal diagram that I'm talking about from Judea Pearl here, this assumes it's legal, right? That the court has the legal right to order the death of a prisoner. And they do in the United States, which is the few Western nations that still has capital punishment. And we still have a majority of states that have capital punishment on the books, even though most of them don't practice it. You know, this gets back to Weber's definition of a state, which is the legitimate use of force. Okay, legitimate. It's legal. The state can execute people. It can commit violence and start wars and so on because it's legitimate. How does it become legitimate? Okay, this gets back to the social contract theory and so on. In the case of democracy, we, the citizens, gave them the monopoly. I forgot to put monopoly. A monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Only the government can legitimately use force. So police, military, and so on. And in this case, courts. So what Trump did in ordering the mob to march to the Capitol, and he said, "I'll be there with you," by which he meant, I'll be in the White House watching TV. And I also tweeted about this, that at least Hitler went to the beer hall Pusht in 1922 in Munich and fired his gun, his pistol, into the ceiling and declared that the German government was toppled and he was taking over. And the next day, famously marched, and he didn't get shot, but the guy next to him got shot. Horst Wessel, one of the soldiers, and that became the Horst Wessel song, and a rallying cry for Nazis ever since. Anyway. Trump, he didn't have the courage of a Hitler. He just went and watched TV. But clearly, the reason that the buck stops with him is because, but for, now this is this kind of counterfactual causality. That is to say, A happened, Trump gave a speech. B happened, the mob marched on and stormed the Capitol. Now, how do you know that A caused B? And so this gets to David Hume's discussion of causality, that A happens, then B happens, what he called constant conjunction. And this is how the human mind works. A happens, then B happens. I vaccinated my kid, and then he was diagnosed with autism. Vaccinations must have caused autism. Okay, sometimes A does cause B, sometimes A doesn't cause B. So you have to have some mechanism of determining that. And so, of course, Hume was just setting up a straw man here. And his example he used, which he got from previous literature, that, the rooster crows and the sun rises. And that happens every morning. So constant conjunction, A happens, the rooster crows. B happens, the sun rises. But does A cause B? No. A's just a down the line, down the ladder causal proxy for the sun rising. Obviously, the light from the sun triggers some mechanism in the rooster's brain to wake up and trigger this instinctive crowing. Anyway, but of course Hume just debunks that. Says obviously constant conjunction is not a reliable method of determining causality. So this is when he introduced his second factor, counterfactual causality. That is to say, if you take A away and B still happens, then A wasn't the cause of B. And so you silence the rooster and the sun rises anyway. Okay, so it wasn't the rooster after all. Okay, here's what I'm getting at. And in the law, this is called the but-for causal factor. That is, but for the shooter, the person who died wouldn't have died. Okay, so but for this, then that wouldn't have happened. So but for Trump giving a speech, the mob would not have marched on the Capitol. Now, there's still information coming out to even today that's new, and there'll be more coming in the days and weeks ahead, that this appeared to be more organized than it looked initially. And so it appears that there was some planning going on, so we don't know who was involved in that. Obviously, Trump and his family were involved, but who else was involved? So that could factor into the causal sequence here. But for Trump giving that speech and saying, let's go, they wouldn't have gone. So Trump definitely is the top, element in that equation of determining causality. And who else? Well, I mean, there was Giuliani and Trump Jr. egging everybody on, and the language was pretty close to inciting violence. Not quite. I mean, there could be wiggle room if you want to play linguistics there, but there is this idea of common knowledge that Steven Pinker talks about in his linguistics research that you say something and that the other person knows what you mean. Again, this is in this case, the previous case I mentioned, working toward the Fuhrer. When he says, "I want you to take care of that," like the mob boss, take care of that for me. And so and so knows what the boss means when he says, "Take care of it." And so it isn't necessary to give specific instructions. So Pinker's example is also my favorite from the movie. What's the movie with the couple of criminal? Fargo, where the couple of thugs get pulled over by the police, and because he didn't have new plates, and he wants to take care of it right there on the side of the road, rather than having to get a ticket or be hauled in, because they've got the kidnapped woman in the back seat under a blanket, and so he puts a $50 bill up in his wallet next to his license and registration that the policeman has asked for, and he hands it to him, and the cop says, "Well, what's this?" And he said, "That's my driver's license. I just thought we could take care of it here in Brainerd," with the $50 bill just nudging up a little bit as a bribe. So it's, there's a probable denial there. I didn't say, "Can I give you $50 and you let me go?" But it's implied, right? Or the other funny example is, "Would you like to come up and see my etchings?" And then the funny New Yorker spoof on that, where the guy and the woman are down at the bar, and he says, "Wait here, I'll go up and get my etchings and bring him down." Sort of missed the point of that, sort of that common knowledge that's shared between people without having to say it. So first, I think Trump and Giuliani and Trump Jr. and so forth didn't need to say it. It was clear what they were doing there. So when you say, "Let's march down to the Capitol and let's be strong," they know what "be strong" means. We know what they all know what the boss wants. He wants the vote count of the electoral votes to stop. And anyway, so I think clearly the fact that all of that was illegal makes not only Trump culpable, but all the way down the line, the other people like Giuliani and his son, Trump's son, and the people, of course, who marched on the Capitol and committed the violence, they're also guilty. They should all, in a sense, they should all be locked up. I don't know about the president legally, how that can happen. Again, probably just impeachment, and even that's probably not going to happen. And maybe it'll come down to something like Nixon's argument that he made in the famous David Frost interviews. When the president does it, it's not illegal. Oh, well, that certainly is not the case, but, will it come down to that? Well, okay, so here's I continue on my tweets just this morning. Although in causal inferences there are usually many causal vectors, A, B, C, D, ... causes X. So Trump, Giuliani, Cruz, the Republicans who went along with the rigged election false conspiracy theory for political gain, QAnon supporters, far-right MAGA people, on down the line to the people who actually march there. They're all guilty of this and suspect of it, which is why, again, that, we debunk these kinds of crazy ideas and stay on top of it and spread the word as much as we can. That is really important. And anyway, so that's my thoughts on this. The whole thing was, from an American perspective, is quite embarrassing. The Banana Republic comment that George W. Bush made. I mean, when George W. Bush emerges as a great statesman compared to Trump, that tells you how far we've gone. Same thing with Mitt Romney. I mean, he's emerging to be a solid statesman that is very respectable. Whereas, at the time, especially George W. Bush in his 2 terms, he got hammered pretty hard by the left and by liberals for his policies. And in some cases, that criticism was well-deserved. But now, by comparison, okay, that just sort of tells you how far we've come. What's going to happen with all this? I'm pretty optimistic by nature, but I didn't think it would come down to this. I'm not in the government. I don't, the CIA or the FBI. I didn't know that this mob was organizing as much as they were. So I just figured it'd be yet another Trump rally kind of thing where everybody just goes home afterwards. So it's really hard to predict, but I do think Biden will be a force for stability. And to my conservative friends, stop watching Fox News. They just lie. When Dinesh posted that comments by Tucker Carlson, he immediately said, this is, like within hours of the banning of Trump, this is all caused by, Twitter just wants to censor conservative. No, that isn't why they did it. They explained exactly why they did it. And again, but for the violence, Twitter would not have banned him. So that's not the cause. So I would go so far as to say that Tucker Carlson just lied to his viewers. But as we've seen, he has millions of followers, millions that watch him. And by the way, conservatives apparently are not into wanting to, break up Fox News. And you don't hear liberals talking about breaking up the government, breaking up Fox News. So they counter with CNN, which is also largely unwatchable these days. The media landscape is, it's difficult to know what to watch, but, I don't want to talk about that here. But in general, I think Biden will be a stabilizing force. He's not a socialist. He's not a communist. He's not going to drag America down into the level of Venezuela and so on, like all these liberals, conservatives are already saying. None of that's going to happen. And even though the Dems now have control of the Senate and the House and the White House, I still think he's not going to take us too far down the road. Although I do think that but for Trump and his crazy behavior the last 2 weeks, the Georgia election might have gone the other way. Of course, I don't know this for sure. Nobody does in counterfactual thought experiments like that. But for Trump, I think the Republicans would have at least won one of those two seats, and therefore they would have maintained control of the Senate, which would have then kind of given them some buffer against what their fears are, is that the far left is going to capture Biden and the centrists, liberals, and then push us too far to the left. So I'll just conclude by noting that historically, duopolies do tend to dominate most industries or landscapes, social landscapes, including politics. So, we have two parties. I do wish we had more, like in Germany. They have multiple parties. Nobody captures more than 50%. And most of them are way less than that. And so they have to make compromises. Nobody gets too much power. We have so many great checks and balances built into the Constitution. But the duopoly thing is a little scary. Because if one side goes too far, it's hard for the other side to keep them in check. And we've seen that in the last 4 years. Let's hope we don't see that in the next 4 years where, let's say, the far left, the AOC crowd, captures Biden and pulls the country too far to the left. And this is, again, an argument why Trump was so bad for the Republican Party, because conservatives do have many good points about keeping the system relatively stable. Sort of going back to the French Revolution and the American Revolution, and the original first intellectual conservative Edmund Burke's argument in support of the American Revolution but against the French Revolution, in the sense that change should come slowly, gradually, carefully thought out and articulated legally in writing and so on, which is what the Americans did, as opposed to the French, which turned to the guillotine and violence, and the whole system fell apart. And Napoleon stepped in. Again, strong man steps in when there's chaos like that. And but Burke's point is that change is okay, but careful change, slow change, non-violent change. And so conservatives have some good points about not taking the country too far to the left, although liberals have many good arguments that most of the moral progress we've made, wrote about in The Moral Arc, comes from liberal traditions of agitating for civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, workers' rights, children's rights, and so on. So there, I think the liberals have the upper hand over the conservatives in terms of taking causal credit for the moral progress we've made, which is the conclusion I draw in my book. But nevertheless, without the conservatives to kind of keep the moral revolutions from going too far. Okay, so the point I'm making is this. It's good to have a strong, centrist, slightly to the right Republican Party and a good, strong, just to the left, centrist Democratic Party, and that they kind of push back and forth, let's say, using a football metaphor since there's playoffs today, between the two 40-yard lines, all right? So you don't want either party to go way off to this side or way off to that side, say, playing the whole thing between the two 20-yard lines. That's too much extreme threat of extreme action on the part of citizens, which can then lead to violence and so on. And we are against that. So that's my hope for the future, that the Republicans, let me just say it to my conservative Republican friends, of which I have many, don't do this again. Don't do that again. For your own safety's sake, don't let this happen again. This is insane. Give us somebody in 2024 that's stable and rational and intelligent and a respectable statesman. Okay, enough said. All right, that's all I have to say for today on this topic. We'll see what happens in the coming days and weeks. Nobody knows for sure, of course. I hopefully just nothing too dramatic will happen. Anyway, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.